Well, I mean, first of all, I'm just confused at this point. I really don't understand what this has to do with economics per se, because it actually does cross some economic lines. I think that there have been decent arguments expressed for not taking down the statues by people like Condoleezza Rice, who have said that it's a good reminder of our history, that it's an opportunity to teach people when you walk by these statues about the darkness of some of our history. I've heard the argument that I think is at least partially correct, that there's a slippery slope, that if you remove some statues, what's the limiting principle? Where do you draw the line? And you saw today there was a commentator on CNN who said that we should pull down statues of Washington and Jefferson. You know, I thought that was an overreach by President Trump, but clearly it wasn't if people on the left are actually suggesting that. But I think there are great arguments for taking the statues down. But here's my problem. I think that this is an issue of local control. I think a lot of these towns are already looking into taking down these statues, and what you're seeing is a lot of people on all sides of the political aisle basically grabbing hold of this issue in order to politicize it. So I think that you have some folks on the left who are suggesting that everyone who supports retaining the Confederate statues is a racist. I think you have some people on the right who are suggesting that everyone who says that they should come down is a nut job who wants to take down statues of Washington and Jefferson. And I think you have President Trump who's taking advantage of the situation in order to misdirect away from the press conferences that we saw earlier. But
I think in order to listen to Condoleezza Rice's point and what Ben just said, I think that there is some truth to that. But the problem is that people then revere and they're taught a false history of what those statues mean. And the best way to do it is to put them in a museum where you can go there and actually learn. Someone can put it on tape or whatever. You can have an instructor say, this is Robert E. Lee. Here's what he did. Here's his history. This is what has been said and written about him, rather than just having someone and a whole group of racist people revere a figure that and a history of a figure that's not necessarily true.
Look, I think Ben hit on a perfect point here, is that this is about this is a local issue. In the South, I view historical issues much differently than those in the North. Growing up in Atlanta, I'm very familiar with the racial issue and the slaves and that part of our history. But it is a part of our history, and there needs to be a way we can preserve our history without hurting people or without people feeling uncomfortable. I saw you raise the Confederate flag at the beginning of the show. I've been through South Carolina hundreds of times in my life, and now we understand how that is harmful to people and hurtful to people, and we need to take that into consideration. But at the same time, this is not something for the president to do a full swoop across the board. This is a local issue. It needs to be decided.
Let me give you. This is a stark example, and pardon me for my clumsiness here. But just imagine there are people. If someone wanted to erect. Or have a school called the Osama bin Laden Middle School for Learning, whatever, and someone wanted to put that up.
Well, that's not part of America.
But that for African Americans, Robert E. Lee, that represents Robert E. Lee. This was our Holocaust, right?
Right.
This is what happened to us. We would rather not go to schools. We're not saying that people shouldn't learn about Robert E. Lee. We're not saying that Robert E. Lee's statue should not exist in some form somewhere, but it should not be part of a public building, especially something that is paid for with federal tax dollars. If you want to have it in the privacy of your home, have as many Robert E. Lee statues as you want. If you want
to, is the implication? I do have to ask you: is the implication here that everyone who opposes taking down the statues is a racist?
No, that's not what I said. I'm not saying that at all. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we should have a conversation just like we have now, and I don't think that at all. I'm just trying to get you and others to understand how people of color feel about those statues.
Oh no, I fully understand that. If I were a black taxpayer, I wouldn't want to pay for the upkeep on these statues either. Yeah. I mean, I get it. I totally get that, and listen, all I'm saying is that it's a local issue.
I think I'm the only person on the left, on the so-called left, who hasn't spoken tonight about this. First of all, with respect to Alice and John and everyone, this is not a local issue. This is an issue about America's history, a national history that affected millions of Americans. 600,000 people died in the Civil War. It was the bloodiest war in American history. 50,000 people died at Gettysburg, 20,000 at Vicksburg, 20,000 at Antietam. We can't celebrate the history of a man named Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis who took up arms against the United States of America. I don't know where everybody else draws the line, but I can draw the line there. You can distinguish. It is very possible to distinguish what Robert E. Lee did and what Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson did from what Thomas Jefferson and George Washington did. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, though they were slave owners, never took up arms against the United States of America. And for a president of it is treason. And for a president of the United States in 2017 to endorse treasonous, traitors, murderous, racist, and to celebrate that is unacceptable. And anyone who stands up in favor of that is, in my opinion, is not respecting the true culture of what America is supposed to represent.
All right, I've got to get to the break. So, but also we're going to talk about this because a Missouri lawmaker is saying that she hopes Donald Trump is assassinated. So I'm back now with my panel, and yes, we talked about all of this during the break, all of us here. But I want to move on now and talk about a Democratic Missouri state senator from the University City posted that, this is in St. Louis, posted and then quickly deleted this Facebook thing saying she hoped that President Trump would be assassinated. Senator Marie Chappelle Nadal, she came to prominence during the whole Ferguson and Michael Brown situation. She quickly took it down. The U.S. Secret Service and in the St. Louis field office investigating, and both Senator Claire McCaskill and the chairman of the Missouri Democratic Party have called on her to resign. What do you say?
There's no excuse for that. There's no reason for that. Clearly, this is an emotional issue. Clearly, when this started over the weekend, we could see things bubbling over. Unfortunately, I think the president from the get-go didn't handle this correctly with regard to not coming out completely unequivocally denouncing hatred and bigotry and racism, and he dropped the ball. But what that has done, that has created a ripple effect of emotions and conversations and discussions, and this is where we are today.
Yeah. And look, the president should own his own words. He's responsible for his words. And she said, the way I responded this morning was wrong. She told the Star, I guess the newspaper, I am frustrated. Did I mean the statement? No, I am frustrated. Absolutely. The president is causing damage. He's causing hate. She has to be responsible for her words like the president's responsible.
Well, at least, and I don't in any way think what she said was right, but at least she had the courage to say she was wrong. This president never says he was wrong. This is a president who got up there last year during the campaign.
But you're not making excuses for her.
I'm not making excuses for her, but I'm saying this is a president who got up there last year during the campaign and spoke about Second Amendment remedies in case Hillary Clinton was elected, which was a clear threat of assassination.
But
he never admitted he was
I understand
wrong.
that, but this is whataboutism. Yes, you're right about all that, but still, she's...
No, you're right. It's wrong.
Yeah.
You can't say anything other than it's wrong. We could just end the conversation there. But the point is, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. He's supposed to be not only the political leader, but also a moral leader of the country. He cannot do that. He can't condemn other people when he's creating the culture of violence himself.
What do you say to this, Ben?
You know, I think that when it comes to the culture of violence, this is something where we really have to be careful, and I think we all should agree on this. This is pretty obvious stuff. You don't call for people's assassination.
Right.
I think that there are groups like Antifa out there that are violent. Forget Charlottesville. They're violent in other places like Sacramento. They've been violent in Berkeley. Violence in our political discourse is not a thing that should be happening, nor should it be incited or forwarded. But I think that we have to be very careful about distinguishing between actual insightful language, like what we're talking about here. I mean, the Secret Service is now investigating this, and just nasty language. I think President Trump says some really nasty, terrible things. You know, at the point when he actually calls for violence, I condemned him, and I will condemn him again. I think that in this case, what we're talking about is something much more explicit than anything Trump has said so far, obviously.
Yeah, I've got to run. I'm sorry, everyone doesn't get to talk. John, just a segment. You talked a lot last segment. Thank you.
It's because it's a fight he can win. The American people don't actually trust the media at this point, mainly because the media seem like they're representing their own interests. We're like a separate class, as opposed to people who are defending the interests of the American people. And the more we get into slap fights with the administration, the more we get into slap fights with politicians on behalf of the press, on behalf of the media, instead of on behalf of the American people, the more the American people are going to be likely to just ignore it. They're just going to say, okay, it's another slap fight, right?
I understand where you're coming from, and I understand there's a lack of trust in media, but people are certainly watching us, Brian, because if you add up the numbers of CBS, NBC, ABC, and CNN, there are millions of viewers, right?
Yeah, this is just the data for the nightly newscast. I tried to pick 6:30 p.m. because it's the best way to show who's tuning in every night. This is NBC, ABC, CBS, plus CNN at that hour, about 27 million on an average night last week. Now, that's a snapshot in time, right? Not everybody tunes in every day. Over time, most of the country is still paying attention to these traditional media outlets, as well as new digital outlets like the one Ben's at, like the Huffington Post and the BuzzFeeds and the Daily Callers of the world. You know, there's a very complicated media ecosystem out there now, and I think, you know, we hear Trump kind of attacking the media in general, but there is no one media, and there is no one American people. Many Americans are demanding that the press fact-check the new president, but at the same time, many Americans are skeptical of the press. You know, it's a very complicated situation.
Let me put this by you, Ben. If a media entity is a cheerleader for Donald Trump and never puts his feet to the fire, won't you lose the trust of the American public too if you continue to do that consistently?
I certainly would hope so. I mean, I think that here's the thing. Every White House treats opposing media as the opposition. The Trump White House, I think, rightly looks at a lot of the mainstream media and says, you guys were the opposition during the campaign. You're still the opposition now. You don't particularly like me. And so you're going to be much more critical of me than friendly outlets like Fox News, for example. But the job of the media should be to understand that we're always the opposition. If we're the fourth estate and it's our job to check the government and it's our job to check the White House, it shouldn't matter whether you like or dislike the person in the White House particularly. You should be treating the White House as your opposition. The fact that the media did not treat President Obama as much as the opposition as they are President Trump is giving Trump the opening to slap you guys around. And I think that he's largely correct in slapping the media around by saying that there is a bias that exists for Trump that didn't exist for Obama. The best way to respond to that for the media is not to defend ourselves by saying, well, that's an attack on the press, that's an attack on the media. It's to say, okay, look, say what you're going to say. It's either true or it's false. And then treat it as a true-false statement as opposed to a fight between the media and
this whole idea of freedom of speech and this conversation is very important to me, and I'm glad to have you on to talk about it. So what started out as a neo-Nazi murder in Charlottesville and the president's failure to denounce Nazi and white supremacists exploded into a discussion in this country about the removal of Confederate statues. Have we gotten away from the point of what happened in Charlottesville, what it was really about?
And it seems to me we clearly have, and I think that was the point of the alt-right and the white supremacists seizing on an issue that they know that there's actually broad public consensus on not moving a lot of these statues. There's a Quinnipiac poll that came out today showing that 50 to 39 Americans aren't big on the idea of moving all these statues out. So they seized on an issue that they think is a winning issue for them and then tried to broaden out their appeal that way. And I think a lot of folks on the left fell for it. They want to have this discussion anyway, and so they saw the opportunity to have this discussion. But it seems like a misdirection from what actually happened in Charlottesville. The issue in Charlottesville is white supremacy, not whether some people think that statues should come down or stay up, because clearly 50% of the American population doesn't want to keep these statues up just because they're a bunch of white supremacist racists.
Did liberals get played by President Trump?
I think pretty clearly they definitely fell for what was, whether he plans it or not, a trap for the left. I mean, he said, you guys don't have a limiting principle. You're going to go after statues of George Washington or Christopher Columbus or Thomas Jefferson. And now you're seeing that actually happen on the left. The most obvious stupid case is this banning of this reporter from ESPN named Robert Lee, an Asian guy, from covering an event at University of Virginia. You know, the political correctness of the left is actually driving people into Trump's arms, even though Trump's initial response to Charlottesville and then his Tuesday response to Charlottesville was entirely wrong. I think that one thing that Trump has had, he's just benefited from the fact that the left is constantly reacting to everything he says with an enormous level of passion, and I think that that's actually a negative. Even what he did last night insofar as going after the media, because the media reacted instead of doing objective analysis of where he was not telling the truth, they jumped to, you know, extraordinary critiques of his mental health and talking about how he was crazy and how he was morally bereft and all this stuff. All that does is it plays to his crowd. His crowd thinks that the media is out to get him. His crowd thinks that the media have a particular emotional animus for him personally. And so anything that the media do is going to exacerbate that.
Well, two things. And by the way, just because ESPN, I want to get it correct. ESPN has responded, and they're saying they didn't ban the guy's name is Robert Lee.
They moved him off of it.
They didn't ban him. They asked him if he wanted to, and he picked something that was closer to his family. They said that they didn't ban him, and they were looking out for his own interest.
They're trying to take away our culture. They're trying to take away our history. And our weak leaders, they do it overnight.
The media is simply responding to people who are there protesting and to the story of the statues being taken down. The media hasn't called for the statues to be taken down. So I don't understand when he says the media is trying to take away your culture. What is...
Well, I mean, I do think that one of the conservative critiques of the media, and this has been true for as long as I've been alive and probably before that, is that the media have an agenda, a political agenda, and they hide behind this patina of objectivity in order to press forward this political agenda. You know, Don, you were very passionate about President Trump's statements about the media last night, and I think some of that was justified, but I think a lot of it actually goes to what his base thinks, which is they think that you have an animus particularly for President Trump, that you have an animus for his agenda on things like Confederate statues. I think you personally probably want to see these Confederate statues come down. I mean, would you, don't you, is that true? I mean, I would assume you do.
Listen, I lived in the South for a long time, and to tell you the truth, I knew the statues are there. I was offended by the statues. Whether they should come down, I would leave it up to the individuals. But I do think that they are insulting to people, just as you would you want to see a statue of Hitler as a Jewish
No, I totally
person,
understand
right?
your point of view. The
would
point
you want
is
to go
that you have
to,
a point
which
of view,
I made
right?
earlier, would you want to go to, and listen, we shouldn't pretend that there's this fake objectivity. Everyone has a point of view. It doesn't mean that you're biased. And so, but just to get people to understand, as a Jewish person, you would not want to go to a Hitler high school. Well, that same effect, African Americans, that has the same effect. Robert E. Lee has the same effect on African Americans. And so, and also the Confederate flag. And so I think we have to be understanding of each other. It's not that I don't like the president or have an agenda against the president. I'm simply speaking the truth as I see it.
Okay, so and I totally understand that, but what he's saying and what his people are hearing is he's saying essentially that you do have an agenda in terms of what you think, promulgating what you think about Confederate statues. You have a clear point of view on that. That's a perfectly acceptable and I think understandable point of view, but the implication is that you are an objective reporter who's actually propagating a point of view, whatever that point of view may be. I mean, you just said openly that you don't think that your point of view is biased, but your point of view clearly is biased.
But
I mean,
what I said about the president last night coming out of his speech had nothing to do with statues. I was talking about his behavior on stage. So that had nothing to do with that. Yeah.
Again, totally understood. But the way that it read is that you have a personal animus toward the president, and that's the way he wants to play it. So whether that's true or not, that's the way that a lot of his followers are going to take it.
I only have a personal animus towards ignorance when people don't know their history, whether that's the President of the United States, a guest on this show, or someone I speak to on the street. I think if you're going to be able to, you need to be able to defend yourself. And in order to defend yourself, in order to have a right, clear perspective, you need to know history and you need to be educated about it. And in many ways, I think people who are fighting for these issues are not. And that means the people who want to take the statues down and some of them who do not want to take the statues down.